the best way for Alberta and other producing provinces in this country to maintain competitiveness in that market is to have the lowest carbon intensity barrels of oil and the lowest carbon intensity gas.
Our province is simply done with what amounts to a steady stream of economic sanctions and punitive measures thrown upon our citizens and businesses to intentionally damage their livelihoods.
Welcome back to Question Period. As we've been talking about this morning, the federal government has finally announced its oil and gas sector emissions cap. The sector, along with Alberta and Saskatchewan, though, are pushing back, saying the cap could amount to production cuts and add more of a regulatory burden, while environmentalists want the timeline for the cap's implementation sped up. So how will the cap play politically for the Liberals? The Scrum is here to talk about that. Charelle Evelyn is the managing editor at the Hill Times. Stephanie Levitz is a Parliament Hill reporter for the Toronto Star. And Marieke Walsh is a senior political reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Good to see you. Marieke, I'll start with you. You were covering this for the Globe. I think you had the scoop this week on what this would look like. The Liberals often politically do well to be in the middle, to have kind of different sides mad at them. Is this one of those cases or something different?
I think it is, in the sense that I think, interestingly, we actually saw the government move quite significantly from what their aspirations were for this gap, for what they thought as environmentalists should be happening in the sector, and what they actually put as the proposal on the sector this week. I think that from their perspective, they have moved significantly. And so I think it will be interesting to see whether the industry, how we saw sort of industry groups respond this past week, but we didn't see individual companies give their view yet. And I think how they respond will be interesting, because I think, in a sense, the government is calling their bluff. You say you're net zero for 2050, you say that carbon capture works, so we are just essentially saying you have to do it. You say you can do it, so do it.
Does it add more credibility to, do you think, Stephanie, their climate plan, and does that matter to them politically?
Well, I mean, in the one sense, it's a promise partially fulfilled, right? They didn't go as far as they had originally promised to go in terms of the emissions they were going to ask the oil and gas industry to bring down. They've sort of rejigged that aspect. But it is, they did say they were going to bring in this cap. They promised it. So it is a check mark on their climate to-do list of things they said they were going to do. And every government wants that. They want to be able to go to the voters and say, hey, we have done this thing. And listen, politically, I mean, the people who are opposed to it politically were always going to be opposed to it politically, because it's a tension between whether you ought to let the free market do its own thing and move ahead with its own promises, or the government absolutely must step in. That's a bigger question about where you view the role of government, never mind what you think about climate change.
Do you think, though, I certainly don't want to deflate the criticism that comes from out west, in particular from Alberta and Saskatchewan. I know we've kind of become used to it, and that it could be characterized as predictable, but it is sort of, I think, at least from the viewer feedback I'm getting right now over the past number of weeks, grounded in a real sentiment that because of that carve out, for example, for home heating oil, the federal government is continually willing to help out parts of the country that they see as politically more expedient, and continue to target, in the view of people who live there, places like Alberta and Saskatchewan and the industries they rely on.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to happen, absolutely. And there is always, like you said, there is that element of predictability in terms of, well, any time that there is going to be a quote unquote target on the backs of the oil and gas industry, that is ultimately going to be the target on the backs of those, prairie western provinces who don't vote Liberal anyway. So what does it matter if we, follow through on our promises that they don't like, because, we're not losing anything there. That is something that the government absolutely has to juggle. But at the same time, there are all kinds of different things that are being done in different parts of the country that aren't going to help everybody equally. But ultimately, we are talking about climate, and that is I think the message that I don't know if the Liberals are really delivering, that this is not about, helping or hurting one part of the country. It's kind of supposed to be helping everybody, the entire country, the people who are being affected by, melting ice caps, wildfires, droughts, all of those things. And they're not pushing that point, and they're letting the opposition just kind of run away with it and say, no, actually what you're doing is hurting people's livelihoods, and provides an opportunity and an avenue for someone like the Conservatives to say, well, you know what, we're on track to become the next government based on the polling. So you guys fight this fight, we'll back you up, and when we come in, we'll just clear the board.
Yeah, my sense is that the Liberals are trying to get back to the message that Charelle is speaking about, but they really hindered themselves in the ability to land it because of the way in which that carve-out for home heating oil was rolled out, surrounded by all the MPs from Atlantic Canada.
And not just the carve-out, it's also the fact that the Federal Environment Commissioner has said that they're not actually fully delivering on the promises they made on climate. And what's interesting, and something that the government really intentionally buried this past week, is that they released their updated sort of tracking on their emissions plan for 2030 at the same time as they were releasing this oil and gas cap. So they sent out a press release to journalists' inboxes while they're at this press conference with the ministers on something else. And that press release and that report shows that the government is still not on track for the 2030 targets. And that's really the issue for the Liberals right now. On the left side of their flank, that credibility on climate. What's interesting is this oil and gas cap actually, if it does get in place, which is a big if with an election in between those two implementation dates, if it does get in place, then they are essentially on track, according to experts who study the sort of trend lines and where it's going. But the question is, can they credibly actually deliver it in time, and can they get across that finish line, essentially?
Well, like Marieke said, there's an election in between.
Yeah, and that's the interesting bit. And this is where, all eyes to Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party, riding high in the polls, haven't come out with any sort of detailed platform on climate change. But it's worth saying, one of the things Mr. Poilievre keeps talking about is technology, not taxes, technology, not taxes. So in this particular instance, when you're looking at a cap and trade system, where you're looking at incentivizing technologies for carbon capture and storage, when you're allowing industries who don't meet the targets to offset that in other ways, what exactly would Mr. Poilievre find to disagree with in this approach, and would he remove it? And let's also remember the governments of Alberta and Saskatchewan, it's not to say that they're, putting their fingers in their ears and saying, la, can't hear you, don't believe in climate change. They have their own ideas that they think can support the industry through a transition. And so, maybe some of this stuff ends up implemented at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think the tension between Alberta and Saskatchewan and the government on this instance, Charelle, is around the idea that I think Marieke alluded to. They think that the industry, who has expressed their commitment to meeting those net zero targets, can get there on their own through incentives, more of the carrot approach, versus the government, who seems to believe that at least a partial stick approach is necessary to force it over the finish line.
Yeah, there is absolutely that tension, but at the same time, you also have, I would agree with Steph, like they're not governments of Alberta and Saskatchewan, they're not sticking their fingers in their ear, but in some cases and in some places, they are, actively standing in the way. So there is this uncertainty kind of bubbling up underneath all of that to say, yes, we have our own ways to get there, but we don't want to try.
Yeah, the only caveat I would add is in the latest two instances where they decided to stand in the way, the Supreme Court said they were okay to do so, and they were actually in the right. So I feel like there's a sense of buoyance on their part now, saying, oh, well, we can keep down that path because the Supreme Court has, in those two instances, not in the original carbon pricing one, sided with us. Okay, I got to leave it there. Thank you very much to the Scrum. Appreciate the discussion. Marieke Walsh, Steph Levitz, and Charelle Evelyn.